Okay, so let's get started. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar on Koyfin and how to use it for financial advisors and RIAs. My name is Rob Koyfin. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Koyfin. Not a coincidence that my last name sounds like the company name. So let me just share my screen and go over the agenda for today. Just basically summarizing what we're going to be talking about. So on a high level, kind of the things we're going to focus on are market dashboards and some macro dashboards that I think you'd find all pretty beneficial and useful. ETF snapshots, how to look at ETFs, mutual fund snapshots, how to look at mutual funds and sort of the essential information there. Graphing and how to visually display data as it relates to ETFs, mutual funds, and economic data, and then finishing off with how to create a watch list and portfolio. And just before we get started, just wanted to remind you that number one, this conversation is being recorded, and we will send you a link of the recording afterwards, so that if you are so that you don't have to take notes and you could sort of focus on the demo itself, and you'll have a chance to revisit it with a link afterwards. And there's also an opportunity to ask questions at the end, so we left some time for that. So feel free to ask questions in the Q&A chat in your Zoom link. So let's get started on the agenda here, and I'm just going to open up my Koyfin page here, and I'm going to mute my do not disturb. Perfect. So the first thing that I wanted to focus on in terms of market dashboards in our system, in our overall system, and the way to think about our system is you have kind of some key parts here. The top part here is just kind of the most used items, the most used functions on Koyfin. So you could see those here. Then the bottom part here is kind of the easiest to understand, which is the security analysis. I put in a security and then I analyze it here. And then we have this market dashboards, and the market dashboards are where you browse different parts of the market and you browse kind of like what's going on in the market. And so we've laid out a bunch of different market dashboards for you. Before I start going over these key market dashboards, I wanted to highlight kind of one feature in here called market news, which I think is really differentiated from some of our competitors. In that one, we have a lot of different news sources here from the web and news that we license from MTN. But this top news panel, you could see here the trending news. So this kind of tells you what's going on in the market and some headline topics. And then the other thing that you can do is you can create your own little news panel. So these are all tabs that I've created, but if you hit this news panel and you can name your screen. So let's say I want my market end of day summary. And then I get to filter out the topics I want here. And these market summaries are one topic that I think are really good. You could browse the different topics here, but if you click summary, you could sort of decide or designate what are the things I want from my market summary. So here I have ETFs, let's say equities, and let's say my market summary USA. And now that I created that, that's going to be my end of day market summary news tab. And so going forward, any news story that relates to market day summary will be here. And so this is a really good way to get a overview and a understanding of what's happening at different points in the day, so that if you haven't had a chance to check in the market, this is a really quick way to see what's going on. So definitely encourage you to look at this market news and then create these market summaries that are more customized for the topics that you want. The next part I wanted to focus on in terms of market dashboards, there's a bunch of different assets here to analyze. Let me start with the sectors, because just understanding sectors is really important. So the way these dashboards work is we have all the assets here on the left-hand side that you can browse. You can select which columns to display here. So if I wanted to display, let's say, the year-to-date change, or I wanted to display the 3-year percentage, I could select these columns. And let's say I wanted to move up the year-to-date change, I could do that right here. And now that these columns selected, I could just start sorting by these columns. So if I wanted to see kind of what's happening over the past year, I could sort over the past year. Pretty clearly, energy has been going up over the past year, and everything else has been going down to various degrees. Staples, utilities are flat. But this is a really good way to get a sense of rotations in the sector. So if I do the 1 year basis, these numbers are going to be correspond to what's going on a 1 year basis, and I could look at it for longer time horizons. So kind of understanding where we are on a 5 year cycle or a 10 year cycle. And this really kind of speaks to what's been going on in terms of tech leading up until this point, and then lagging, and then what's been happening over the past year with energy kind of leading. The defensives have been sort of flat and outperforming on a relative basis, and then some of the tech names and discretionary names have been underperforming. So tracking this is really essential, and I think we do a pretty good job of putting it all in one dashboard and making that easily available in one place. The other dashboard that I think is really useful, and a lot of advisors uses this factor dashboard. So what we do is we have all the different factors here, the style factors, the qualitative factors, the size and value factors. And so we normalize this versus the SPY. So that's pretty important. It's versus the S&P 500. And again, this kind of gives you a sense of what is going on a short term, on a 1 year basis. So if we sort of zoom out on a longer term basis, let's say a 10 year basis, we sort of know that growth was the biggest driver or biggest positive or outperforming factor up until sort of 2022. It had a huge run, about a 10-year run. And then on the flip side, you had value have a huge underperformance over 10 years. And that's been reversing over the past 2 years. And that's kind of really impacted a lot of asset classes, a lot of performance, whether it has to do with commodities or credit. And so just monitoring these rotations, whether it's on a daily basis, which we allow you to do with these daily changes, they'll really explain sometimes what's happening when these factors move a lot, or whether it's on a little bit longer time horizon, like year to date or 3 months, I think can really give you a sense of what's happening in factor land and how that explains in terms of some of the cross currents that are going on that are impacting your portfolio. Next thing I wanted to highlight are the global yields we have. So we have all global yields. I'm pretty sure most investors here on this call are focused, or at least spend most of their time on the US. So we do have the US yield curve here, which I've selected here, but we do have the other global yields as well. So to the extent that UK gilts are selling off or Japanese JGBs are in the press, maybe you're not trading those, maybe they're not informing your investment decision. But to the extent you want to track those and you want to have them on a screen and you want to get a perspective on how they're moving over time and how they're potentially moving versus US treasuries, you have all the information here for you to browse over here. And again, kind of this 10-year chart really speaks to what's been going on in yields, with kind of like yields doing nothing for a very, very long time, and then really exploding here and continuing to climb higher today. The other thing that I mentioned is we just introduced a new feature where these yields are live. So all these numbers are going to be ticking live for the major yields. So that's really useful. And so that allows you to track the yields throughout the day. And then we also have the yield curves. The yield curves we define as kind of like 2 points in time. So for example, in the US, we have the 30-year versus a bunch of different 10 years, the 10-year versus a bunch of different 10 years. Probably the 10-year versus 2 year is the most popular one. But if you wanted to look at another yield curve, these are all here. And these all have tickers associated with them. So to the extent that you wanted to pull them up in a graph in the security analysis, you could either type it in here, or you can click on this, on any of these tickers. So if I click on this ticker, it's going to load it up into my security analysis here, and then allow me to really graph this and really analyze this further. So that's on the yield curves. And then just the last thing I'll point out on a macro level is this corporate credit chart that we have. So to the extent that you're looking at corporate credit, we have all the different corporate credit indices here for you to track. And these are end of day, so they're not live, but you can toggle between the total return, the effective yield, and the spread versus treasury. So there's a way to toggle these and not just look at the yield or the performance. And so if we're looking at kind of the spread over 10 years, we get a sense of where we are today. Maybe Euro high yield is not something we want to look at. Let's maybe look at the broad high yield market as our data point. And this kind of gives us a sense of where we are historically relative to the range. So over the past 10 years, I'd say we're pretty much in the middle, but easy way for you to track all this corporate credit stuff in one place. So we have a bunch of other different market dashboards here. I'm not going to go through them, but you could click around and they all have a similar structure, whether it's currencies or commodities, and you could browse and monitor those on a day-to-day basis. So that that's what I wanted to. Those are the most important kind of dashboards I wanted to cover. Let me sort of move on the agenda to analyzing ETFs. So when we think about ETF data, and we cover ETFs very deeply, we have a lot of interesting ETF data. If you put an ETF here into the security analysis, you get a bunch of snapshots that you could look at. So one is the historical snapshot or the overview snapshot, which gives you a chart. It gives you the flows, so the flows of what's going on for this ETF, and then some key data points in terms of performance, competitors, shares outstanding, the AUM and the fund flows over time. And then just a quick list of the top 10 holdings, which we have a more detailed view on in another tab. Also have this description tab. So to the extent that you're looking at the SPY, you probably know what the SPY is, so you don't need to know kind of description. But if you're looking at a bond ETF or maybe a smaller ETF or a newer ETF, it helps to really understand kind of like what is the goal or the description of this ETF. And then some other trading data behind it, like classification and benchmark and characteristics, number of holdings, and fees. Very importantly, we have listed here as well. And then the third tab, which is the holdings tab, is probably one of our most differentiated and interesting tabs. And so what we have here is the holdings of SPY. So it's the 500 stocks. Chart here is showing you the weight versus the 12-month return. Or you could change this to be any sort of return. So just showing you kind of like what are the biggest contributors or detractors from the ETF. Obviously, the bigger something is, the more it contributes, the more it outperforms or underperforms, the more it adds or takes away from the performance. So this is visually telling you kind of what's happening and kind of how that impacts. And this chart, you can also kind of zoom in and zoom out. So super interactive and how this works. And then the data is laid out in a table on a single security level, on a sector level, on industry level. The weight here is kind of self-explanatory, is the weight of each security. The return is self-explanatory of the security over the past kind of whatever time frame you choose. The one interesting kind of column that I think is worth mentioning, explaining is contribution, which is weight times return. So this is decomposing the return of the ETF into the contribution. And what's interesting about the contribution is that it is additive. So if you add up all the contributions, that equals the return of the ETF. So if I'm looking at SPY on a one-year basis, the one-year return is minus 17%. And if I sort by contribution, I know Exxon is up 46 basis points, so contributing 46 basis points to that return. It's sort of the biggest contributor by far. And I know that Microsoft, Amazon, and Meta are all taking away about 130 basis points. So about 4% in total, these three stocks are contributing to the minus 17% return. So that's about 25% or a little bit less. It's 4% or 4 percentage points out of minus 17 is being attributed to these three stocks. So kind of interesting to think about what's contributing the most or how that performance decomposes. And you could do that on the stock level. You could also think about it on a sector level and on an industry level. So on a sector level, tech is 26% of the index and contributing minus 650 basis points of that minus 17%. And we know that it's being driven by these really large stocks. So a lot of interesting ways to peel back the onion and understand kind of what's going on a sector and a stock level in terms of the contribution and the holdings. And then the other thing that you can do is you could download these to a watch list. So make sure you're aware that if you have if you wanted to do analysis in Excel, you could download this to a Excel sheet. The other thing that you can do is if you're interested in monitoring the constituents of an ETF. So let's say I had the like XLE in here, and these are the constituents of the XLE. I could actually download these into a CSV or an Excel file, copy the tickers, and then paste them into a watch list. So that's a really useful hack. If you're trying to create watch lists that are comprised of ETF constituents, that's a pretty quick way to do it in terms of downloading it to Excel and then copy pasting those tickers into a watch list. And then the last thing that we have here is the kind of dividend snapshot, just giving you a sense of the dividend yield over time and just some of the dividend payments over time. The next thing I wanted to go over is just what this looks like for a mutual fund. So if we have a mutual fund, so I'm going to use Fidelity Magellan because when I graduated college in 2002, this was sort of the mutual fund that was probably the most popular one at the time. So I still use Fidelity Magellan in all my demos or every time I have to pull up a random mutual fund. But this is Fidelity Magellan Fund. The overview gives you a sense of how, if you invested $10,000, where would that $10,000 be today, starting at whatever time frame you choose. On the bottom here, we have the cumulative or the returns by quarter. So this is every quarter. So every year we'll have 4 bars, what the returns were of this fund. So decomposing the return on a quarterly basis. You can kind of like move this around and customize it to yourself. And we also have the key data here. So the key data of for this mutual fund in terms of AUM, in terms of benchmark, in terms of similar funds, in terms of price and performance, fees, and portfolio characteristics in terms of valuation and what these look like. We also have that description tab in terms of what the company does for the description, and then all the related securities here. So I think Fidelity Magellan only, well, based on this data, the Fidelity Magellan Fund only has another class, so only 2 classes of shares. But if you're looking at a mutual fund and you're thinking about which other classes of shares, like if I know LALDX is supposed to be have a lot of shares. So it'll just list kind of like all the shares, so you're aware of all the shares that the fund has. And then we also we do have some delay here. We do have the holdings tab for mutual funds as well, so that if I click on the holdings tab for Fidelity Magellan, we do have all the constituents here, similar type of analysis in terms of what is the highest holdings weight, the historical change, and what's contributing and detracting the most from this mutual fund, and similar analysis on kind of how these are contributing both on a stock, sector, and industry level to really decompose the returns over time. So that's the mutual fund and ETF snapshots. And let me kind of go over to the graphing section next. And this is really the heart of kind of like what Koyfin does in terms of the graphing and some of the functionality that we have related to graphs. So let me just do SPY here, because there's going to be more things that are going to be available for me to see. So if I have SPY here, the way this graph works is this series manager allows you to control what's kind of displayed in the chart, but these charts are interactive, so I could zoom in, zoom out from my chart with my mouse, or I could select a data series here. I could also kind of highlight different things. So if I wanted to highlight different things on the chart, I can do that with these tools as well. So a lot of interactive ways, a lot of different functions to interact with this chart. But let me go over some of the most common series that a financial advisor would use. So obviously, just the price chart is pretty important. The investment growth, which we looked on the snapshot. So if you're looking at something based on $10,000 invested in the beginning of the period, this is something that you could pull up as a series. So now, obviously, these two things are going to be super correlated or going to be almost one for one. But the way to think about it, kind of starting at 10,000 and ending wherever, is a pretty useful way or pretty useful series to have. The other thing that you can do is, for example, you could look at the 1 year change. So if I look at the historical rolling change, which is right here, and I look at the 1 year change, this gives me the picture or the representation of every point in time. I now can see how the ETF performs over the past 1 year. Right? So I could look at it on a 10-year basis, on a 20-year basis. And I think most of the time, you'd probably be looking at something like, let's say if we're looking at FMAGX again, you might want to compare the 1 year change of SPY versus the 1 year change in FMAGX to see kind of like the biggest differences. And let me just make these a little bit different. So what I'm doing is I'm playing with the settings here to make sure the colors are visible. So let me do this as kind of black and white versus, yeah, I think this works blue. So my blue here is the SPY. My red here is the FMAGX. And so now I have a sense that over time, on a 1 year rolling basis, where's FMAGX outperforming or underperforming in the cycle? And so I could see here that kind of when the market sells off or as the market has sold off, kind of in this period in 2002, in 2012, in 2009, FMAGX has underperformed. And that sort of makes sense because when we looked at the holdings, we know that they're overweight tech, or the fund is overweight tech. And it's overweight growth. And so it makes sense that when the market sells off, this fund underperforms. And then when we think about kind of outperformance, it has outperformed in these periods, particularly when growth has done well around this point. And so this lets you kind of compare things pretty easily and to visually understand how some of these line up on a comparison basis, whether you're comparing an ETF, a mutual fund, a stock. And so this is a pretty quick way to do that. Let me just go over some of these other kind of important metrics that I think you'll find helpful. So instead of investment growth, and I'm gonna just show this again, we could look at also, there's a series called the rate of change, which basically, instead of looking at the, instead of giving you the fixed amount of 1 month, 3 months, you could actually have the number of days this rate of change shows for. So for example, if you wanted to look at the 3 year rate of change, it'd be 252 is 1 year. So that's how many trading days are in 1 year. So 3 years would be 756. So if you wanted to look at the kind of like the 3 year rate of change, the 3 year rolling rate of change, this would be it. This would sort of show you what that looks like over time. Let me just change this to a line. Maybe it's a little bit easier to see. And so this, this can give you a really nice sense of, for example, with SPY, looking at the 3 year rate of change, sort of been pretty consistent up until this is 2000. Oops, let me just see here. Up until 2020. You had this huge spike before on a 3 year rate of change basis, and now we're sort of mean reverting. So this is kind of an interesting way to look at something and look at the consistency of something and see if that mean reversion might come in play. And you can see here that mean reversion came in play here, that mean reversion came in here. And on a 3 year basis, we're definitely kind of getting to below of where we have been historically, at least for the past 10 years. And maybe we could look at this for kind of like everything and what these 3 year returns have been over time. or what the average 3-year return has been over time. So that's an interesting measure. Another one that I think is really important is drawdown. So I know I see this a lot in kind of different whenever I look at different pitches or how financial advisors speak to their clients in terms of thinking how drawdowns affect either a particular stock or particular fund or particular ETF, and just being able to identify these drawdowns and visually see these drawdowns over time. So for example, if I had SPY here, and I'm just gonna hide this, and I put FMAGX here again, and then hide this. I now see kind of the drawdowns and sort of something that we saw before, which is how do you think about drawdowns, and how do you think about the beta or the defensiveness of this particular mutual fund during these periods. And so this is a really interesting series and a pretty useful analysis in terms of thinking about these drawdowns. And by the way, if you wanted these to be on separate charts, because right now they're on the same chart, we do have that functionality in the legend. So you can see here in the legend, there's a little icon here. It's nice and hidden, which makes it hard to find, but it is here, which takes us to a new view panel. So if I wanted FMAGX to be in a new panel, I would hit this button, and now I get two different charts with the drawdowns. If I wanted to combine these, I would use this button again and combine these, and now it would be on the same chart. So depending on what you're trying to show and how you're trying to show it, this functionality is available for you to create a new chart with these different series. Let me kind of go to some other functions here. So instead of SPY, maybe let me put in like XLE here as my main security here. One thing that you can also look at is correlation. So the correlation of something versus something else. And by default, we have the SPY here, but if you wanted to correlate, let's say XLE versus, versus whatever the Vanguard S&P 500 or something else that you think is a better benchmark, you can do that. You could extend the time frame. I think the blue only starts here. So let me go back to SPY. You could also change the correlation window here. So what 21 days means that every point in time, we're measuring the 21-day correlation. But if you wanted to, 21 days is 1 month. But if you wanted to measure the 3-month for 63 days, you could do that as well. And that becomes a little bit smoother. If you wanted to measure the 1-year correlation, you could do 252 days. And so that becomes even more smoother, but just showing you how these are correlated over time. Volatility is another interesting measure that we have here. So if you wanted to show the realized, let's say 3-month volatility or 1-year volatility, we have that here. And so that will show you how historical or realized volatility looks and trends over time. And then the last kind of technical series I'll show you is the beta. So thinking about the beta of something over time, a rolling beta. So here, again, the default here is SPY. We look at the 1-year beta by default. But interestingly here, let me just remove these series. If I look at XLE over the past kind of 10 years, and I draw this line here on one beta of 1, really interesting to kind of see how beta has evolved for XLE. And kind of now it's becoming a little bit more of even a defensive sector, or the beta has been more defensive. So on down days, XLE has been more defensive, and we saw that from the sector performance graph that over the past year, even though the market has been down, XLE has outperformed, and so that's kind of like what this beta is confirming. And this would actually be, if I were looking at this, I would probably think about. I would start thinking about what does this mean if it mean reverts, if it goes higher, and what are the implications of that? So that's on the beta side. The other thing that I wanted to mention to you is once kind of in terms of these series, once you have the series that you like to look at, so let's say I wanted to look at beta and I wanted to look at correlation and I wanted to look at whatever. You could then save this as a template, so you don't have to pull up these series going forward every single time. So what this template does is it sort of saves those series for you. So you could pull them up with any other security going forward. So if I save this as my, let's say my beta and correlation for 20 years as my template, that saves it here. And just take off these grid lines because I don't like grid lines. Let's save. And so do 20-year. So that means tomorrow when I log into Koyfin and I start fresh, and I have a security here, let's say it's XLF, I could go to my graph, I could pull up my graph, and then I could pull up this template here, which is right here, beta and currency, beta and correlation, and all these different series are saved here. So this is a really useful feature here to save a bunch of templates. I have a bunch of templates here in terms of how I look at stocks on a free cash flow yield and a share repurchases and all these other ways of looking at it. I think many of you probably don't look at single stocks and you would have different templates, but just remember that once you find these series, you could save these as a template and you could pull them up pretty easily going forward. The other thing that I wanted to show you is that make sure that you know that this share print button is here, which is super useful. What that does is it allows you to create this chart. You could click on it. You can copy this image and paste it. You can add an image here to customize it with your logo. So to the extent that you're trying to communicate with a potential client or a client and wanted to send them something and put your logo on here, you just hit upload image. It would take you to your computer. I'm just going to use kind of like Hightower, which is something that I demoed recently. And so this is my logo. And then you could give it a title, right? So you could say that energy, correlation, and beta. And I would probably want to make this a little bit bigger because by default it's pretty small. And now this is my chart. Again, I could copy this image, paste it into another, paste it into an email or into a PowerPoint or whatever it is pretty easily. So we make it really easy for you to share these different graphs with other users. And then the last thing on graphing I wanted to mention is just some ways of looking at relative performance and understanding performance. So that's really important, and I think at the core of what you all are doing. So one way to look at relative performance is you could add a series called relative strength, which basically divides two ratios, one by another one. So for example, here it's XLY divided by SPY. If I had a mutual fund in here, whatever it is, it would just be divided. And it allows you to basically see kind of like what outperformance or underperformance looks like over time. So let me just change this back to XLE because it's going to be a little bit easier. Oh, and because I didn't save that as a template, that's not here anymore. So let me just add that here. And now I have this ratio. And so, we talked about before how value is starting to outperform since 2020. And you can see here in the relative chart, XLE versus SPY, that's been in a downtrend since 2008. It's just starting to kind of form an uptrend since 2020 for the past 2 years. But you could see kind of like these relative performance charts really allow you to see a sense of outperformance or underperformance over time. So that's pretty useful as a data series to know about. And then the other way that you could think about relative performance or a ratio chart is in the search box. If you actually type in XLE:SPY, so colon lets our system know that you want to do a relative chart. And if I hit enter, it says, oh, hey, by the way, you selected a relative chart. You could then kind of select a G chart, which is the shortcut for historical graph. And that's actually going to pull up a line of XLE divided by SPY. So if you ever wanted to do a relative ratio quickly, right from kind of the search box instead of adding series, you could sort of say like Meta versus Apple, hit enter, hit G. I'm just going to do my price and volume. And that's gonna create the relative chart really quickly. So a really fast way to see these relative charts right on the graph. And then the other thing I wanted to mention on performance is this performance graph that we have, which is different than the historical graph. So historical graph, if you think about historical graph, it's sort of the Swiss Army knife. It could do graph anything. So if I wanted to graph 10-year yields versus SPY versus Bitcoin, and I wanted to graph inflows or outflows, I could do that on a historical graph. What performance graph does, and I'm just gonna do my SPY here, load SPY. What the performance graph does is it basically normalizes everything at 0 and just shows you the performance. So if I wanted to add QQQ and I wanted to add, let's say, Bitcoin, and I wanted to add Tesla, and I wanted to add the Euro USD exchange rate, these are all now normalized to 0. The other thing that we do, which is really nice, is we give you the compound annual growth rate, or the CAGRs, for each one. So Tesla, the CAGR over the past 3 years is 135%, pretty insane. But you could see, let me take away Tesla because it's probably ruining, or Bitcoin is probably ruining the scale as well. But if you wanted to understand kind of the CAGR of assets, this is a quick way to do it. So over the past 3 years or 5 years, I have these growth rates, or these annualized growth rates, and you could see what it looks like on the chart. And then I can also, again, share this chart and generate this image, give it a title. The title saves here, but this is going to be like SPY, QQQ, Euro USD 3-year percent. Save that. And that's my chart title now. And again, I could copy that and send it along in any format that I want. So this performance graph is super interesting. It's really useful. It's one of our most used functions, because that's, obviously what you all are doing day in, day out, is thinking about performance and thinking about which assets are outperforming, underperforming. And you could do that very quickly here in this, performance graph. Just to, one thing to note here, just a technical note, this performance graph shows the total return of ETFs and mutual funds. So this is going to show the total return of anything you put in here. So stock, ETF, and mutual fund. One kind of quirk of our system is currently we don't have total return of indices. So if you put in a index, so for example, SPX index, that's actually going to show you the price return because we don't have total returns for indices. So if you're looking to compare total returns, use the ETF. Now you sort of have an ETF for any index you could think of. If you put an index here, it's just going to show you the price return. But mutual fund, ETF, stock is going to show you total return. So that's on the performance graph. Okay, so we're 2/3 of the way there. Last thing I wanted to show you was on watch lists, which are really useful and really popular. And so the way the watch list function works is here under my watch lists. I have all my watch list tabs here. These are the different watch lists I have. I also have this menu where I have all the watch lists listed. So it's a little bit of a more compact way to navigate the stuff. And if I wanted to add a new watch list, I could add it kind of like here, or I could hit this plus button and add a watch list here. So let me just demo watch list. I'm just add one here. So in here, I'm going to add some tickers. So I'm going to add my favorite FMAGX, and let me add some more kind of mutual funds in here. So let me add my Dodge and Cox fund. Let me add my Putnam, let's see, Growth Opportunities Fund. And then I'm going to add let's say, Franklin Tech Climate, that's select tech hardware portfolio. Cool. So these are the 4 mutual funds I added for kind of just showing you a representation. Obviously, you'd be able to add whatever you want. In here, the most interesting thing here is that you could choose then what columns you want to display, and all the kind of column information is here that you could browse from. And then once you select the column information, you can then save a different configuration of columns as a view. And so right here, this is my watch list view. So anything kind of I do here, like let's say I remove these columns here because they don't make sense for mutual funds, and I only have these columns. If I go back, if I log in tomorrow, or I click off, these columns save as my watch list view here. So I could kind of like add whatever columns I want. The other thing that you can do is you could save a view or this column configuration, and then you could save it in my views. And what this means is that you could actually use it for any watch list, not just the watch list you're on. So for example, I have a my view here called, let's see here, mutual fund performance. And what this mutual fund performance is, it's a configuration of columns that just has the year-to-date return, the 3-month return, the 1-month return, and then some of these keggers. So what the kegger is for the past 3 years, the 5 years, and 10 years. And again, these are all these columns that I found by searching through, let's say if I hit kegger, and rolling annualized performance is kind of this performance kegger. And if I hit this, you have the option of choosing 3-year return, 5-year return, 10-year return, and then 1-year return. We don't have a kegger because it's not really kegger. You have to just pull up the 1-year return as a total return. So once you sort of look through these columns and find the columns you want, don't forget to save them as a view so you could use them going forward for other watch lists. And by the way, just wanted to highlight that we do have a lot of mutual fund columns here that you could choose from specifically for kind of just mutual funds. So what the sales growth is, or what some of the fundamental growth metrics are, what the weighted average market cap is, what the net asset value is, what the fees are, what the benchmark is. So just a lot of different mutual fund columns to choose from. I have some of these selected here. Maybe in here, I could show you kind of some of these. So these are some of my kegger columns. These are some of my classification columns for mutual funds. This is just showing you what the growth rate is for certain valuation metrics to have those here. This is showing you the latest valuation metrics for these different funds. So PE, price to book, RSI, stuff like that. And then some information in terms of what the market cap weighted average is, what the type of fund is. Yield to maturity obviously isn't applicable to these equity funds, but if I put in like a bond fund, we do have a lot of bond information, right? So my LALDX here is, once it loads, I think, I'm not sure why it's loading. So always good idea to just hit refresh, see what happens. Oh, there it is. So my bond fund, my LALDX, the benchmark is going to be a different benchmark. It's going to be a bond benchmark. There's going to be a yield associated with it. And then there's going to be just a lot more information, or a lot of different information. So the yield to maturity is going to be populated here as one item. There's a duration item here. I'm not sure where duration is, but there's a duration item that obviously is only applicable for bond funds. So here, nominal maturity and effective maturity. So this is kind of the duration of the fund. So that information is here as well. So that's pretty interesting. And then the other thing that you can do, so this is kind of organizing it for mutual funds, or you could do it for equities, or you could do it for stocks. And then the other really interesting thing, or a really useful thing that you can do with these watch lists is create a portfolio. So if I have this mutual fund demo, let me just add a couple more tickers, SPY, QQQ. I'm just going to add these over here. And I'm going to, the way that you can do that is basically in these columns. If I, just load this other one because it's going to be easier. If I'm in my column view and I click columns and I wanted to create a portfolio, what I would have to do is go to these portfolio tools. And in these portfolio tools are kind of like my portfolio columns. Notice this typewriter here. What this typewriter means is it's a user inputted field. So meaning that for quantity, number of shares, I get to input that for all my stocks. And then my weight is calculated based on the quantity. And so if you wanted to like input the average cost, that's going to then populate my total gain loss. Obviously, without the average cost or the cost basis, we're not going to be able to populate that. But let me just focus on quantity and weight here as my two fields that I have. And I'm just going to move these over here. My weight, and I'm just going to delete some of these because it's going to be a little bit easier to fill out. So if I have, let's say, if I have these 4 funds in here, and I'm just gonna put in some shares, some hypothetical shares. So 3,000, 4,000, 4,000, 4,000. Cool. So now this kind of gives me my my weights. Obviously, the notional or the nominal last price here is very low. So let me just add kind of here. So this is now 45 and cool. So maybe this is the portfolio that's a little bit more representative, where the weights are a little bit more even. Obviously, once you put in the real weights of whatever portfolio you're looking at, these weights are going to automatically fill out. The one useful thing to highlight here is in the summary row, you could add a weighted average sum. So what this does is for every column, this calculates the weighted average for the portfolio weighted average for this column. So whether you have a return or a PE or a duration measure, this is going to tell you what the average is for the portfolio. So this is really useful to have and to understand for a performance metric or some other fundamental metric what the weighted value is. And so this is kind of our basic portfolio functionality. I know many of you have asked for kind of model portfolios and thinking about portfolios more like once you input a portfolio, how do I look at the historical performance over time, the drawdown, the characteristics, and that's something that we're going to be working on pretty soon. But right now, you sort of get this basic portfolio functionality, and we'll be working on the kind of more advanced stuff in the next iteration, probably end of this year, beginning of next year. Okay, so that covered a lot of ground. Let me just pause there. If you have any questions, please paste it in the Q&A chat, and I'll go through it and I'll ask any questions, whether it's about what we just covered or upcoming functionality or about the company, whatever it is. So let me do that. Let me pause there, see what questions there are, and I'll read those in a sec. Okay, so the first question for Gabriel, you asked about kind of how do you go about saving graphs. So we don't have the ability to kind of like save graphs as a folder. So I think what you'd want to do, or the question you have, or the feature suggestion is, if I have a graph here, I just want to save this somewhere. I just want to hit save and have like a folder of graphs, which is a pretty cool and useful feature, which we are thinking about and we want to introduce. I'd say right now we have these templates, which you could save as templates. So if you have just a bunch of different series that you'd want saved in a template, and the way that the template works is the secondary securities are saved as part of the template. So if I have here, let's say US 2-year as my security here, and my US 10-year as my security here. These are all kind of like templates that are saved. Sorry, these are all securities that are saved as part of my template. So if I wanted to save a bunch of stuff, a bunch of secondary securities, I could save that as part of my template. And then I'd obviously have to pull that up with a primary security, because that's how the template works, is you have to choose a primary security. So that's one way. The other way that you can do it is in my dashboards, which we didn't cover because it's a pretty big function and we just didn't have the time. But in my dashboards, if I create a blank dashboard here and I have these components, I could add different things. So I could add a graph here, which would display which would then tell me like, hey, nothing is loaded in here, and the way I load something is in here. So if I wanted to do US 2-year, I could look at the 2-year here, look at kind of like the 5-year basis, stuff like that. Let's say I wanted to add another graph, and if I want these to be different securities, like I don't want these to be based on the same security, I would just have to change my group selection. So what this group selection does is, if it's in the same group, any security loaded in one is going to be tied to everything else in that group. So if I don't want them to be tied, I would sort of do B, and I would do, instead of SPY, I would do US 5-year. And now this is my 5-year graph, and so on and so on. And so you can make these, you can make these graphs pretty small, and kind of have a bunch of graphs. And so I would say kind of like the best way to do what you're trying to do, which is save a graph and come back to it, is just create the graph in this dashboard. And this is now called like dashboard 18. And so if I log in tomorrow, I go to my dashboards, I go to dashboard 18, and these securities are going to be here for me to pull up. And if I hit this little jump link, it's going to take me from the dashboard back to the main graphing section. So if I hit this, it's going to open up the graph with the securities. So that's the best way to do that. So I hope that answers your question, Gabriel. So Corey wants to know is the rate of change price return? Is the rate of change price return or total return? The rate of change is based on, it's a good question. So let me just show you kind of how that works. The rate of change is going to be based on your setting here, which is the adjusted versus the unadjusted. So if you want the price return, if you want just the price, it's the unadjusted. So adjusted is knocked out here. If you want the total return, you have to sort of like adjust it for dividends. And so that's going to be the difference here. We have a help article. So if you Google Koyfin help adjusted versus unadjusted, we talk about this kind of dividend adjustment that we do. But that's the way to think about kind of price return versus total return for the rate of change. It depends on if you have the adjusted or unadjusted setting here toggled on and off. So for Bogdan, hey Bogdan, a couple of questions. Wow, 4 questions. Okay, so the investment growth, how are dividends treated in there? Are there some assumptions of reinvestment, or is it based on total return? There's no assumptions on reinvestment. So what we do kind of on a technical basis, we would just add back the dividends that are paid once a stock pays a dividend and the price goes down. So for example, if I'm looking at, let me see here, let me just do maybe TLT as a good example. So if you look at the TLT over time, if I don't do the adjusted, you're just looking at the price of TLT. And what this does is every time TLT pays a dividend, it doesn't go back and adjust the price historically, because the price falls every time a stock pays a dividend. So when we adjust it, we go back and adjust the historical price based on that dividend. So it's as though you were paid the dividend, but you can do whatever you want with the dividend. You could invest it in the risk-free rate, you could invest it back, but all we're doing is just giving you back the dividend as cash. We're not reinvesting it in the futures. And then for yield curves, Swiss one, cool, we'll try to find that. And then for the weighted average, and then graphing the portfolio we talked about before for the weighted average in terms of graphing the performance and the weighted average over time. So hope that answers that question. Michael wants to know, do you guys have future and option quotes, and will you have bid ask anytime soon? So because we're not a trading platform, we don't really have bid and ask. That's something that definitely comes up from time to time. We don't have great futures coverage. We have front month futures. So if you're looking at CL1, which is oil, you could pull that up here. If you're we just don't have kind of that futures coverage for NASDAQ futures or S&P futures. It's just something that is a pretty high data cost for us, and we haven't really added that to our system. So I'd say we want to add those because those are important especially for kind of tactical traders. But it's not super high on our priority list for the next kind of several quarters. If I had to take a guess, it'd probably be the back half of next year is when we would look to add futures data. Options data, very, very similar. Options data is really interesting, particularly with combining it with some of the fundamentals we have for stocks. But that's kind of like a really big data set, a lot of work involved in implied vol and all the other functionalities. So that's probably going to be towards the back half of next year. So it's going to be a little bit later on our roadmap. Can we see aggregated data such as PE for an ETF? So the valuations that we have for different ETFs sorry, we don't have valuations for ETFs. I was thinking about mutual funds. We do have valuations for mutual funds. So if you pull up like the Vanguard 500 and you go to mutual fund and you pull up kind of the Vanguard 500 Admiral Fund, which is going to be representative of the S&P 500, we will have that information here. So we will have that aggregated information here. But I think kind of the next question is, do you have that over time? And we don't have that over time. So we do have this information, kind of high level snapshot information for mutual funds, but for ETFs, we do not have that data currently. And then John wants to know, what is the source of the data for mutual funds and ETFs? The source for our mutual fund data is Lipper. The source for ETF data, we have several sources, but we get our holdings data from ETF Global. We get our price data from the exchanges. We get some fundamental data from Capital IQ. So it's a hodgepodge of sources for ETFs, and for mutual funds, it's currently Lipper. On the news filter, can you add a restriction to a particular watch list? Great question. So on the news filter, I think, Brad, you're asking, can you basically tie a news filter to a watch list? And you can, you can't do it in here. What you would have to do is, again, create a dashboard. So in my dashboards, if I have a dashboard here that I created, and I want to call this news, in here, you could add a news widget. So I could add a news widget, which is right here, and that news widget can be tied to a watch list. So right here, I have all my watch lists here, so I could tie it to Rob's watch list or my SAS watch list or whatever it is. We also recently made an enhancement where you can actually have your RSS news here, which is kind of the web-based news. The premium news, which is MTN Global, the filings. So you could select what you want. So let's say I just want my premium news. And so that would be here. And if you wanted your RSS news, you could select it here and then actually filter by source. So if you just want to see, let's say you just want to see the New York Post and New York Times and CNBC, and you don't want to see Zacks or Zero Hedge, you could just select a filter here. So these are kind of like your filters. And now anything in that watch list is going to be filtered for, let me just select here, RSS. It is going to be selected for those RSS sources. So I'm not actually sure if there's going to be articles based on that, on those tickers. So it looks like there's no articles based on those filters, but that's the way to look at the watch list news based on, basically you create a widget in a dashboard and tie that widget to a watch list. Okay, so that's done. For screens, can you add an option to group by sector as we do in watch list? So in screens, let me just see here, in screens, what you would have to do, so if I have a screen here, just loads up. If I have a screen here, what you can do is you can then have one of your views, and I believe, no. Okay, so what you would have to do is you would have to basically copy the results to a watch list and see it there. So if this was my screen, let me just make sure it's not kind of like a crazy amount of securities. And sorry, if I could just back up, what we're talking about here, the question here is about our screening tool in my screens. And what this allows you to do is screen for stocks. So if I have a screen here for software stocks based on these criteria that I have, the question is, can I group these by a particular sector? Can I group the results by a particular sector? How does that work? So what I would do is I would copy the results to a watch list. I would call it this. And then in here is where I would then have to group it by sector. Obviously, this is all going to be in tech. So that's the way that you would need to group it. We don't have the grouping function directly in the screener. So Jesse wants to know, is there a way to download data to Excel from charts? Unfortunately, we used to have that functionality. We don't anymore. Brad wants to know, how are your employees in Ukraine doing? Thanks very much, Brad, for asking. As some of you know, we have a lot of employees in Ukraine. About half of our team is based in Ukraine. And so we've been dealing with kind of the chaos that's happened in that region for the past 6 months. Overall, our team is doing okay. Obviously, there's a lot on their mind in terms of kind of dealing with this on a personal level and thinking about it. But most important thing is the team is safe. A lot of them have relocated to other parts of Ukraine where it's a little bit quieter. Other people have moved abroad. The team that's in Kiev, and we had some team members that were in Eastern Ukraine, which was kind of really affected by the war. And so Kiev up until the past week has been quieter, but over the past week, there's just been a lot of bomb raids. And so it's been disruptive, but I could tell you that our team is awesome. They're really strong. Everyone is continuing to work somehow. But obviously dealing with this kind of crazy situation. And so, hopefully it gets better, but thank you for asking that. Everyone's doing well. Kennedy wants to know, why are shares outstanding for SPYDS shown as dollars? I'm not sure. I will have to check that. I bet that's a typo. I'll just see here. So the question is shares outstanding in dollars. That's a typo. That should not be dollars. That should just be in without a dollar sign. So we'll have that fixed. Let me just write that down. Thank you for highlighting that. Michael wants to know, sorry, we did that already. Apologize. For the prior PE questions on ETF, can you set up a watch list of ETF components and then use weighted PE? Yes, Jesse, that's a great question. So the question is, that's actually a really good hack that I forgot to mention. If you are looking for kind of like the PE of an ETF, what you would do is, like, let's say I wanted to know the PE of XLE, and I pull up the XLE here. I would go to holdings. I would download the holdings to a CSV file. I would then copy paste them into a watch list. And let me see here if I have one of the ETFs here. So XLK is an ETF that I imported. So I didn't type all these out. I copy pasted them from that Excel sheet. And then in here, you can select kind of like whatever columns you want. So I could select PE and whatever it is. So let me just select my valuation sheet just to show you all these measures. So I could select any sort of valuation measure I want. And then what I could do is I could add a summary row. So I could add a summary row which shows the max, the min, and then I could add a summary row that actually shows the weight, the market cap weighted average. So if I do the market cap weighted average, that's basically, it's actually not exactly how you would calculate the P of an ETF, because for a P, you would add up all the market caps and you would add up all the earnings. So it's a slightly different calculation, but it gets you very, very close to the answer. So for XLK, the price to sales on an MTM basis is 6.5. The PEG is 2.45. So this is a way to look at valuation measures that are market cap weighted. Thank you for reminding me on how to do that. And then question from Jeremy, in performance under graphs, I do not see adjusted, unadjusted button for the performance. Can you clarify whether performance is price return or total return? Absolutely. So the performance graph is always total return unless it's an index. So for an ETF, for a stock, for a mutual fund, it's total return. For an index, it's price return because we don't have the dividend stream for indices currently. So it's not like we're trying to confuse you. Just we don't have access to that data today. And so if I pull up the SPY, again, GM, and I look at the SPX, the SPY is going to be total return. So that return is going to be higher. The SPX is going to be price return. If I pull up FMAGX, it's going to be total return. If I pull up Apple, it's going to be total return. So everything is total return except an index, which is price return. Question from Brad. For the column summary in watchlist, can you add weighted harmonic average? We don't have that. If you can actually, Brad, if you can put that in the feedback button here as a feature request, I'd really appreciate that. And that's something we could definitely prioritize and add down the line. Cool. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all so much for attending this webinar. Really appreciate it. Thank you for being Koyfin customers. We love you as clients. We love your feedback. Helps us really inform the roadmap and what we're building and adding value to you. So definitely reach out to me. My email is rob@koyfin.com or help desk, help@koyfin.com if we could be of use and answer any questions. And we'll try to do more of these webinars. And thanks again. Have a good day.